In trying to solve the terrifying problems that face us in the world today, we naturally turn to the things we do best. We play from strength, and our strength is science and technology. But things grow steadily worse, and it is disheartening to find technology itself is increasingly at fault. Almost all our major problems involve human behavior, and they cannot be solved by physical and biological technology alone. What is needed is a technology of behavior. B.F. Skinner, acclaimed as the most influential and controversial psychologist of our time, wrote those words in his book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity.
Human behavior can be controlled. I think all behavior is controllable, but certainly cannot be controlled. I believe the weather is controlled, but not controllable. I don't think for a moment we're in a position to control human behavior. But I think we can arrange conditions which will have an effect on human behavior, and do. And if we don't, we can't teach, we couldn't govern, we couldn't be therapists, we couldn't do anything. I don't think anyone initiates anything, so there is no one who's going to assume control. There are those who are going to be in positions of controllers: teachers, governors, employers, parents, children, employees. We are all controlling everyone. And whether we do it well or not, effectively or not, will determine whether this culture is going to solve its problems and be around to perpetuate the very practices which define the culture.
Skinner calls for behavioral technology to solve our problems and ensure survival of the culture. To better understand this new technology with its promises and problems, we need to look at the changing views of human behavior. Stephen Goldman is with the Department of Philosophy at the Pennsylvania State University. His interest is in the history and philosophy of science.
Initially, of course, philosophy generated problems as well as the critical examination of solutions to these problems. And when I say initially, I mean in the time of the ancient Greeks. There it's quite clear that philosophers were concerned primarily with 5 questions. What is the nature of reality? What is the nature of truth? What is the nature of good, of beauty, and of justice? It is impossible to escape altogether from the shadows of their analyses. Plato and Aristotle generated attitudes, analyses, and characterizations of human nature which have been very important for the subsequent development of Western science, and I would say especially for the development of Western sociology and psychology.
Plato said behavior came from within the mind. Ideas of God, universe, and self were part of being human and emerged through thought and action. Man constructed the world as a reflection of his mind. Aristotle, Plato's pupil and considered by many to be the greatest mind that ever was, disagreed. There was no previous knowledge. Mind is a tabula rasa, a blank tablet, at birth as yet unwritten on by experience. All thought and action was determined by the effect of the external environment. Little was done to resolve the issue, and this dichotomy of innate ideas and experience was disputed for the next 2,000 years. In the early 17th century, Rene Descartes took the first steps in changing intuitive dogma to scientific reasoning. Impressed by the physics and mathematics of Galileo and Newton, Descartes saw man as composed of matter, occupying space and having weight, a part of the mechanical universe. His behavior was subject to the same laws that guided the movement of the stars. Descartes rejected the notion that body was a slave to mind. He saw an interaction controlled by the brain where body could influence mind, just as mind could influence body. Shortly after Descartes, John Locke supported Aristotle's view by denying the existence of innate ideas. He claimed Plato based his notion on the inability to remember infant experiences. Ideas about God have been exposed to us for so long that we cannot recall a time when we did not recognize God as a concept. There was no knowledge whatever at birth. Mind grew and acquired knowledge through progressive accumulation of environmental experience. Locke said there were two kinds of perception, calling them primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities existed whether or not they were perceived through our senses. Size and shape does not depend on human perception. Secondary qualities existed only in the mind. Touch, smell, taste. They differ from person to person and are not contained in the object itself. In 1859, science began to have a stronger influence. Charles Darwin published his study on the origins of the species, rocking science, the church, and the public. Man's physiological link to lower animals opened questions of mental adaptation. If the body was a result of selective evolution, was the mind? The last quarter of the 19th century rushed psychology into its modern era. In Germany, Wilhelm Wundt established a laboratory devoted to behavior. Scholars from Europe and the United States came to study and proclaim this new science, a discipline separate from philosophy. Wundt's psychology centered on the connections of elements from the environment that made up human perception. Single, indivisible bits of information from the environment joined in the brain through a mental chemistry, cumulatively building perceptual experience. The Gestalt psychologist viewed the world differently. They said there were forms and that we perceive the environment holistically. The whole was equal to more than the sum of the parts. As wickedness, witchcraft, and possession by demons as causes of mental disorders were replaced by theories of chemical imbalances and tissue damage, Sigmund Freud rebelled, saying unconscious feelings had great influence on behavior. He saw man as a social as well as a biological animal. His goal was understanding and therapy. Freud's psychoanalysis used hypnosis and verbal free association as therapeutic techniques. It aimed at helping the neurotic by viewing the total human being over extended time spans, using introspection of both the present and the past. Just after the turn of the century, the pace of behavioral science increased sharply. Nobel Prize-winning physiologist Ivan Pavlov began a series of experiments that would reveal many of the basic tenets of learning and motivation. Stimulus, response, reinforcement, and conditioning. Important concepts in today's behavioral technology. Pavlov saw behavior as a stimulus-response, input-output relationship. He knew a dog would secrete digestive juices when eating food. Pavlov called the food an unconditioned stimulus, and the secretion of digestive juices an unconditioned response. Unconditioned because this was a naturally occurring behavioral relationship, one that was not conditioned or learned. Pavlov found that if he paired an event, such as the ticking of a metronome, with the unconditioned stimulus of the food often enough, the dog would be conditioned to secrete digestive juices when it heard the ticking. The ticking was now a conditioned stimulus, an environmental experience the dog learned to respond to. Just before World War I, John B. Watson jolted psychology, declaring mind and consciousness meaningless terms, inappropriate topics for psychology. He called for a pure science, one describing all behavior through stimulus response. People were caught up in the cry for a world order free from myths and cultural conventions. This typifies Watson's confidence in the new technology. Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors.
I had no psychology in college, but I began to read some articles by Bertrand Russell in the Old Dial magazine, and I read his book, Philosophy, in which he took Watson very seriously. Many years later, I told Russell that he was responsible for my being a behaviorist, and he said, oh, good heavens, I thought those articles demolished behaviorism. But they didn't, because he was taking him very seriously. He qualified it, but he took him seriously. And that got me to read Watson, and then I read Pavlov. And at about that time, H.G. Wells published an article that was very important in my life. He compared George Bernard Shaw and Pavlov. Shaw, the great publicizer and writer, charming man, and Pavlov, the scientist. He said, if you were standing on a pier and Pavlov was drowning on one side and Shaw was drowning on the other, and you had one life preserver, which way would you throw it? And yet I'd throw it to Pavlov. But then that was the point at which I switched from an interest in being a writer to being a scientist. What's inside of man is a man. It's a man, it's a genetic product, a result of the evolution of the species, that has been modified, changed by what has happened to it during the lifetime of the individual. Physiologists will eventually tell us all about it. But the things that we put inside, such as purposes, intentions, ideas, acts of will, and so on, those are not there. They are our inventions, which we use in place of an analysis of the environment. And by using them, we keep ourselves from looking at the environment and hence from discovering better ways of managing ourselves and managing others. No, we're controlled by the environment. That would be the essence, I suppose, of my own position, that we are not controlled by things going on inside ourselves, but rather by our genetic and personal histories.
B.F. Skinner rejected Pavlov's stimulus-response model as being too narrow in explaining behavior. He designed the Skinner box, a controlled learning environment to demonstrate his theory of behavior, operant conditioning. The task for this rat is to learn to press a bar to get food pellets dispensed from a spout on the panel. If left alone, the rat would eventually bump into the bar and a food pellet would be dispensed. This would happen several times, and gradually the rat would learn to press the bar to get food. Essential to making operant conditioning work is depriving the animal of a reinforcement. Food is the reinforcement for this rat, and it has been deprived of food for several days to prepare it for conditioning. Operant conditioning can be speeded up by a technique called shaping. The person training the rat watches its every move. When the rat moves near the bar, the trainer dispenses a food pellet. This brings the rat near the bar much faster. A week later, after a 1-hour training session each day, the only time the rat would get food, it is manipulating the environment of the Skinner box. The mechanism has been set so the rat must press the bar 6 times to receive 1 food pellet. The rat operates on the environment without an observable stimulus, as with Pavlov. Each time the rat receives a reinforcement after pressing the bar, the chance that the behavior will be repeated is increased. The use of these conditioning reinforcement techniques is called behavior modification.
Da, 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 da. Da, da. Good boy. David, look at me. Up. Up.
David suffers from Down syndrome, Mongolism.
David, look at me.
Before treatment through behavior modification, he was unruly, could not communicate with anyone, and was completely dependent on others. By using food and approving words as reinforcements, he can be conditioned to pay attention, understand simple commands, and speak.
David, look at me. Go like this. Good boy. David, look at me. Go like this.
Behavior modification is used in an increasing variety of individual, institutional, and social settings to produce specific behavioral outcomes. Bertram S. Brown is director of the National Institute of Mental Health, a federal agency that supports many areas of psychological research and therapy.
I think there is considerable debate in the psychological field, broadly speaking, psychiatrists, educators, and others. And we can make that debate sort of crisp by overstating either side. On one side, there are those who feel that whatever the behavior is, or let's say it's overindulgence in alcoholism, or headbanging, or just severe phobias about going certain places, that in order to treat it, one ought to get at the underlying root causes, the psychodynamics, right down to the deep psychoanalytic roots. Or on the other hand, that the cause might well be a biological cause, something wrong with the actual chemistry of the body or the brain. The other point of view says, well, that doesn't matter. If it's a behavior that would be treatable by behavior modification techniques, let's help with that behavior, irregardless of whether its underlying cause was biological or psychological. And the debate does range, but what's happening is, as practitioners who are essentially eclectic, those who will use whatever's available, it's becoming more acceptable not only to the behavior modification specialists, but to ordinary practitioners. The other day I received in the mail from a rather respected, middle-of-the-road psychiatrist a letter announcing the opening of his practice in clinical psychotherapy and behavior modification. And that's a good example because he uses behavior modification for certain types of problems. And for others, he still uses psychodynamic psychotherapy and doesn't hesitate to use the drugs, the psychoactive drugs, when that's called for.
Well, it's going through a stormy period right now. It's been identified with brain surgery, electric stimulation of the brain, and vomit therapy, and so on. Those things have to be evaluated in their own right. They should never have been called behavior modification because that term was invented to describe the application of positive reinforcing techniques, right, quite clearly and explicitly so.
It's growing in sophistication. It's a science, so it's cumulative. It's got some rather striking examples of what are practically miraculous in terms of what might be expected a few years ago. Lovas began dealing with autistic children. These children just couldn't be treated before he started doing it. Jim Lent at Parsons, Kansas, is working with severely retarded girls and gets them behaving in ways that just would be unthought of 20 years ago. So it's very effective at times. It's also a very young technology.
Helping teachers teach more effectively and in such a way that students like to learn. Helping parents get along with their children, helping families get along with each other, helping individuals manage their own lives. These are forms of help. That's what behavior modification is. It's a form of help.
You can apply the rules to a large social setting. The rules of behavior, the principles of behavior, weren't invented, they were discovered. It's the way behavior is shaped anyway.
We have, in applying these kind of principles now in a more organized and thoughtful fashion, use sometimes what we call the token economy, where, say, the whole group in an institution, in a halfway house, in a school, in a prison, is given tokens for good behavior, and those tokens will earn certain privileges and freedoms, such as going to the canteen, weekend leave, going to the movies, and the like. So what we're doing here is now using these behavior modifications principles in a larger setting, be it a school or an institution. But they stem from the same basic psychological knowledge earned through research over the last 30 or 40 years.
Behavior modification is being increasingly applied in schools and in mental institutions to both teach and maintain control. But its use as a tool for rehabilitating criminals has raised some of the most serious questions of consent, control, and freedom. James Holland is a member of the American Psychological Association's Commission on Behavior Modification, a group formed to uncover abuses and establish guidelines for professional conduct.
And in prisons, you find guards shaping prisoners into pliant, obedient, docile prisoners. And this is the ideal is a smooth-running institution with everybody quiet and in their place, which is not necessarily the right kind of person to create for outside the prison, and not something the prisoner seeks on his own, but it's the goads exerted from above. And behavior modification very commonly gets used for those ends, and it's almost the rule rather than the exception.
Carolyn Payton is chairperson of the Committee on Ethics for the American Psychological Association. The committee sets standards, investigates complaints, and seeks resolutions to ethical issues.
In the sense that through behavior mod, one can control behavior without the person being conscious of it. And if it were used by an unethical or a non-professional person, I could see some dangers there. It's sort of mind controlling, and we are very leery about any types of techniques or strategies that would allow another human being to be in control of another. So from that point of view, certainly, I can see some of the dangers. On the other hand, I see no reason from this point to rule out all behavior mod techniques.
Thomas Saz is a psychiatrist, teacher, and author. He has often criticized the use of psychology and its techniques as a tool of political and social coercion.
Yes, I think the new technologies are myths. I very much like that term, like that concept. They are, by and large, they are the relabeling, the making scientific what is essentially ethical and political and religious. Now, nobody in the 20th century can make a success claiming that he has a religious theory of human behavior. So you have to call it scientific.
You can't fix a violent person, say a prisoner, by a short or even a reasonably long behavior therapy program isolated off in a prison where you've got control over all those conditions that you expose him to, and then you put him out in some new conditions later. That those new conditions will begin to have their effect, the conditions outside the prison, and he will behave according to those ruling conditions. His behavior is very adaptive. Behavior changes according to whatever the prevailing conditions are, or the prevailing reinforcement contingencies. So that if you set up certain special contingencies in one place, you'll get the behavior to change accordingly. And it'll all seem to work just fine. Then you change, put the person where the conditions are something else, where the prevailing reinforcement conditions are different, and that behavior will just change again. It'll change right on to what's appropriate for that environment. And the prisoners, after all, got in prison because they were in an environment that established the kind of behaviors that got them in trouble. And many of them go back to that, to those contingencies that prevail in the streets of America. And if you want to fix that kind of thing, you have to fix those conditions. You have to fix the prevailing reinforcement conditions. People are in prison because they've done things that are adaptive. They aren't in prison because they're sick. They're in prison because they did things that fit their environment. The kind of thing I've described to you as an abuse is not an abuse that came about because of behavior modification. After all, that's the stratification we have in our society. As the guards were always trying to get obedient prisoners, and the foreman or the management of a plant's always trying to get the most labor out of the working man that he can for the least amount of money. And along comes a new tool, and they can do it better now. But it's not really different. It's the context that's not neutral. And I think the science itself is basically, I think any society works on reinforcement principles, but the form of those principles, that those principles take, can be very different.
But every society's business is to change those who deviate into those who conform. That's what else is new. That is why I say it's a religion. That used to be the job of religion. If you are a sinner, you should become, if you are wicked, you should become virtuous. If you're a sinner, you should become a repentant sinner, a good person.
As any science, we are dedicated to search for the truth. However, in my mind, there may be a time when our search for the truth should take second place to the values and needs of individuals in society.
But I think it's very important that the processes be made as public and as well known as possible, so that we they cannot be misused without people being aware of it. Those who would want to stop this now and no longer study human behavior or sequester what we now know, it would be a terrible thing. It would be like trying to sequester knowledge of the bomb. Somebody's going to get it, and then the fact that we'd sequestered it is held against us and causes more trouble than if we'd made it available.
Whether people understand themselves better, or whether we understand ourselves better now than we did 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago, is very questionable, because a lot of people think, I am one of them, that writers, poets, playwrights have contributed more to understanding human behavior than psychologists.